This is a fishy tale that started with the Koori Mail. Aboriginal incarceration rates remain at shockingly high levels across Australia. It is a tragedy in our community and we know those rates must be reduced. So when I read in the Koori Mail in about 2014 that Aboriginal guys were being prosecuted and imprisoned over fishing, with hundreds of prosecutions in New South Wales just in the past couple of years, we thought maybe at Illawarra Legal Centre we could do something about this issue. So we started having a look in our area and there were two striking issues. One was the poor relationship between fisheries and the Aboriginal community, which was aggravating tensions around enforcement of fisheries law. And the other was that the law itself was ambiguous and inappropriate in its application to the way Aboriginal people use and manage fish. So that poor relationship was scuppering any chances for proper involvement of the Aboriginal community in ways to improve the regulatory regime. And this was in fact demonstrated around that time as New South Wales Fisheries were trying to hold some consultations in our area about proposed changes to the Act, but no one wanted to come given the levels of hostility involved. Illawarra Legal Centre is based in Warrawong, just south of Wollongong, very close to the Port Kembla Steelworks, what would probably once have been an excellent fishing area. It's based on the lands of the Dharawal language group, and our services run from north of Wollongong right down to Kiama, with some of our services going as far as the Victorian border. There are around 13 clans in our catchment, which roughly lines up with the borders of the Yuin Nation. The traditional owners are saltwater people who've been managing and caring for the land and sea for thousands of years. It is a beautiful place to live along our coast, but in the Illawarra, just like many areas, well, just like throughout all of Australia, Aboriginal people are discriminated against and alienated from their own land and sea. Strong cultural obligations underlie the use of seafood, the way in which it is caught, what can be caught, where and when it can be caught, and with whom it must be shared. Those traditions have been passed on from generation to generation for thousands of years. So the importance of that for culture, community, for health, for well-being, it's obvious. But that regime that has been developed in the Aboriginal community over all of those generations now sits alongside a legal regime which is yet to rise to the challenge of properly reconciling two different ways of seeing, using and managing the resource. The New South Wales Fisheries Management Act was amended in 2009 following nationwide adoption of national Indigenous fishing principles. Section 21AA of the Act was passed by the Parliament in 2009 along with those other amendments. This section provides for regulation that would allow special limits. It means that an Aboriginal person practicing Aboriginal cultural fishing would not be committing an offence if they took or had in their possession amounts of fish over the limits prescribed in the Act. But when the amendments to the Act came into force in 2010, Section 21AA stayed off the table. Rather than incorporating that within the body of the Act, the increases for Aboriginal fishing bag limits are now within an interim compliance policy, and who knows what that means. It's certainly been a huge issue for both compliance and enforcement of the Act, with fisheries officers taking a very uneven approach, which is possibly understandable given that instead of dealing with a law, they're dealing with a policy. And of course, there's often plenty of ambiguity around how that can work. In October 2015, the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries, which regulates fisheries, released a draft regulation outlining proposed restrictions on Aboriginal cultural fishing, which would incorporate the higher limits in the interim compliance policy, but not to the same extent. There are still great concerns that the legislation remains overly prescriptive of Aboriginal fishing. Any discussion on these issues with the Aboriginal community are often extremely fraught with passions boiling over, particularly in relation to the ongoing issue of lack of proper engagement and involvement of the Aboriginal community and of Indigenous perspectives and interests. And this has only been aggravated by the way in which fisheries laws has been enforced along our coastline, with Aboriginal fishermen reporting being stalked by fisheries officers, with often their interactions leading to hostilities, police being called, people being arrested, and clearly this is not helping the situation. Central to the tensions in relation to this issue is the extent to which the Act and the regime in general really respond to the cultural imperatives for the Aboriginal community in the way that they manage and use fish. And further to that is the extent to which traditional owners should be managed at all, particularly where they can show their continuous use and enjoyment of the resource, and hence would be able to assert native title over their local waterways. This has led to some extraordinary pro bono litigation efforts in the defence of a couple of Aboriginal fishermen who've been prosecuted for overfishing. And it's involved the amassing of evidence with regard to their native title interests in the fish in their area. Unfortunately, the defence has been so successful, the prosecution has been withdrawn mid-hearing. So we remain without a decision on this issue in New South Wales. So what to do? At Illawarra Legal Centre, we recognise that great work that was being done in relation to the defence of those fishermen. So we thought we could direct our efforts to trying to preempt the prosecutions. So we dipped our toe into the waters about a year ago to look at maybe running a series of workshops with the community. We teamed up with a local organisation, the Illawarra Aboriginal Corporation, and what we thought we could do was see if we could focus on improving that relationship between fisheries and the local community. This is where the community legal sector's approach to legal education really comes to the fore, where we can look at an issue, realise that passions are running high, that it is quite a sensitive area, and that we know that we need to take a slow burn approach. We take our time and we appreciate that we have to give people the chance to accept us before we can have any great effect. At the end of 2014, we got started. We had our first meeting primarily with some of the local elders. We got a few people along. It was more a meeting to hold a meeting. So then we decided to hold a workshop. So that was gathering number 2. People stayed away in droves. I have to say that numbers were mostly boosted by the children of my co-presenter from the Aboriginal Corporation. Lots of calls were being made, but just not being answered. The third gathering was an attempt at another workshop. People had started to talk to each other though about what we were doing, and we had around 20 people come along and they had plenty to talk about. Also, my many calls to fisheries had started to be returned, and a local manager came along and joined us for the second half of the day, and it was a good day. A lot was talked about. By March of 2015, we were up to our 4th meeting, workshop number 4. And again, my many calls had paid off with the CEO of the Illawarra Local Aboriginal Land Council, Derek Hardman, now coming along. And at that workshop, we really started to talk about the issues. I felt like we were finally getting traction, and I totally understood that it would take some time to get to that place. We talked about what we needed to do in relation to improving that relationship. There was really good faith in the community about trying to improve that relationship. And one of the elders was talking about proper cultural awareness within fisheries. And so we said, okay, well, we should hold a session. But from that, it was decided that no, not just have another session in another room somewhere, it needs to be out on the land. And the group chose Killalea, which is a beautiful place. It's just south of Wollongong. It's a camping ground behind a lovely area of coast, Mystic's Beach, great surf spot as well as a fishing spot. and is also an area where there is a sacred birthing site, so an area of great significance. And so instead of that workshop, we had a 3-day gathering in June of 2015, and it just took off from there. It was really thrilling to drive up on that first morning at Killalea and just see the Aboriginal community in full swing, people setting up their tents, kids running around. And we ended up having a 3-day gathering. We had about 150 to 200 people there off and on over those 3 days. They were thrashing out the issues. There was lots of angst, there was anger, there was passion, lots of different perspectives. And it was really extraordinary to see people coming together from right along the coast. We actually had representatives from all of those 13 clans within the Yuin Nation, and it was remarked upon that it was the first time that they'd ever come together. And I was talking to media at the time about it, and I mentioned that it was the first time, in recent years they'd come together. And one of the elders said, "No, Linda, it's the first time ever." And so it was also really interesting to see when the elders would sit down. They might not have ever met face to face, but it'd take about 5 seconds for them to work out the connection, who's related to whom and so forth. And also very movingly, one bloke took me aside, big grin on his face, and he said, "This is the biggest number of our mob that I've seen at a gathering that's not a funeral." Over the 3 days with the barbie going non-stop, there were plenty of meetings going on all across the campground. Representatives from Fisheries, Office of the Environment and Marine Parks, as well as local politicians and the media, visited us over the 3 days. We had a lot of different perspectives about what needs to be done. The community is certainly not monolithic on this issue. Some wanted to work with fisheries, others want to go it alone. It was made very clear that one part of the coast cannot speak for another, and that traditional owners must be the decision makers in their area. So out of that gathering at Killalea, there was a second gathering organised by the community, and that was held further down the coast in September 2015. Another outcome was the formation of the South Coast Traditional Owners Group, and they now liaise directly with fisheries on this issue. Another outcome of the project was increased media coverage of the issue. Clearly this is a significant matter, but there had been very little in the media about it. So one of our early workshops, we invited an ABC radio current affairs reporter along, and she ran a story on that on PM, so that ran nationally. We also had more interviews, and we frequently acted as liaison for journalists wanting to cover the issue. So sort of one built on another, and we've had in-depth coverage on ABC TV, other ABC radio programs, on the Saturday paper, and recently The Good Weekend also ran an in-depth article on the issue. And we think that can only help with increasing awareness and hopefully driving change. So at Illawarra Legal Centre, we're now trying to take a bit of a back seat. We can see the community is up and running with the issue, and we've just let them know they can call on us if they need us, and to us that is what we aim for in legal education and law reform, that we can get an issue up and running and then just let the community know that we're there if they need us.